Good evening. We're going to be in the book of Proverbs today, specifically in chapter 1. I was actually kind of excited to do this, to really be able to delve into it. A long time ago, several years ago, I thought to myself about how I'd like to get some more wisdom. Um, it's always been, something I've desired since I was a kid. And so when I was in my early 20s, I thought I'm going to go back to the book of Proverbs, start in chapter 1. So it's kind of fun to be revisiting it. But it did remind me of one story really in particular that I wanted to share. So my great-grandfather, Theodoru Vanikiotis, or Theodore Vanikiotis, moved to the United States in 1910 from a small Greek Peloponnesian village just outside of the city of Sparta. So his birth and a lot of the official things were actually recorded in the city of Sparta legally. He returned to Greece in 1912 to fight in the Greek army during the Balkan Wars, and then returned again to the U.S. in 1913, where he eventually got married to my great-grandmother. So as a Spartan, my great-grandfather and my great-grandfather, my great-grandmother, his wife, had a lot of like Spartan feelings and beliefs that were passed on. Spartan proverbs, really, that have just kind of gone through the generations. For example, one of them is that really has affected my family for many years is that we often believe that the hardest thing is the right thing. So if it's difficult, it's probably right. But another piece of wisdom that was passed down is the laconic phrases. And it's not just in my family, right? In the larger culture, we actually call these laconic phrases. There's something short, sweet, to the point. And since we believe that the hard thing is the right thing, it really can be boiled down to one phrase that the ancient Spartans used to use, specifically a king, I think it's Lycurgus, but who used to say, "He who sweats more in training bleeds less in war," right? So you work hard now and it won't be as hard later. The training will pay off later. Or another classic one, just for fun, another laconic phrase is that Sparta never built any walls, right? No walls, no castles, no monuments, nothing. And when asked, why doesn't Sparta have any walls? King Lycurgus would raise his arm out to the Spartan men that were with him, and he'd say, "These are Sparta's walls." And the Spartan commitment to doing hard things was actually so great that part of the final training of the agogi, which is Spartan boys training, I'm happy to talk about another time, would make a formation of the Spartan phalanx, and they'd push over a tree. And why? Because the Spartan kings used to laconically quip, "The more you sweat in training, the less you bleed in war," right? Or shortly, "Sweat more now, bleed less later." So just like the ancient Spartans, all the way to my childhood, listening to and practicing the wisdom passed down from our parents, from generation to generation, can keep us safe in a lot of ways and often inform us in a lot of good ways, right? I still really believe that doing the hard thing is almost always doing the right thing. But in the opening chapter, this first chapter of the book of Proverbs, Solomon describes how his proverbs and wisdom, number one, have a purpose. Number two, they can be used for prevention. And number three, they're like a person. Specifically, he calls wisdom a woman calling out for repentance. So, pastors always love alliteration. So it's going to be purpose, prevention, and person. You get it. So let's go ahead and go to Proverbs chapter 1. I'm using the New King James Version, but whatever you've got, perfectly fine, should work to follow along. So we're just going to read chapter 1 all the way through. The Proverbs of Solomon, the son of David, king of Israel. To know wisdom and instruction, to perceive the words of understanding, to receive the receive the instruction of wisdom, justice, judgment, and equity, to give prudence to the simple, to the young man knowledge and discretion. 5. A wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding will attain wise counsel. To understand a proverb and an enigma, the words of the wise and their riddles. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge, but fools despise wisdom and instruction. My son, hear the instruction of your father, and do not forsake the law of your mother, for they will be a graceful ornament on your head and chains about your neck. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, "Come with us," let us lie in wait to shed blood. Let us lurk secretly for the innocent without cause. Let us swallow them alive like Sheol, and whole like those who go down into the pit. We shall find all kinds of precious possessions. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Cast in your lot among us. Let us all have one purse. My son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your foot from their path, for their feet run to evil, and they make haste to shed blood. Surely in vain the net is spread in the sight of any bird. But they lie in wait for their own blood. They lurk secretly for their own lives. So are the ways of everyone who is greedy for gain. It takes away the life of its owners. Wisdom calls aloud outside. She raises her voice in the open squares. She cries out in the chief concourses, at the openings of the gates in the city. She speaks her words. How long, you simple ones, will you love simplicity? For scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge. Turn at my rebuke. Surely I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you, because I have called and you refused. I have stretched out my hand and no one regarded. Because you disdained all my counsel and would have none of my rebuke. I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your terror comes. When terror comes like a storm and your destruction comes like a whirlwind, when distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me. Because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would have none of my counsel and despised my every rebuke. Therefore they shall eat the fruit of their own way and be filled to the full with their own fancies. For the turning away of the simple will slay them, and the complacency of fools will destroy them. But whoever listens to me will dwell safely and will be secure without fear of evil. So in the first section of verse 1, right, Solomon lays out the purposes of his Proverbs. And the purposes, I think, are in three categories. They are to receive, to understand, and to know. Right? To receive, to understand, and to know, in case you like these fingers better. Solomon uses words like receive, such as in verse 3, when he says to receive the instruction of wisdom, right? Justice, judgment, and equity. In other words, the purpose of Solomon's proverb is to receive the teaching of wisdom, which are justice, judgment, and equity. Justice, judgment, and equity. He also uses the word attain. Right? In verse 5, he says, a wise man will hear and increase learning, and a man of understanding will attain wise counsel. Solomon says that his Proverbs teaches that a wise man will get wise advice because he will actually listen to it. Solomon also says his Proverbs are to understand, right? In verse 6, he says to understand a proverb and an enigma, the words of the wise and their riddles. In other words, the purpose of his Proverbs are to understand other proverbs and riddles and puzzles of the mind, right? An enigma. To understand the wise words of elders and of others. Lastly, Solomon says that the purpose of his Proverbs is to know. In verse 2, he says, to know wisdom and instruction. And in verse 7, to know the fear of the Lord is the beginning of knowledge. But fools despise wisdom and instruction. So receive, understand, and know. Furthermore, the purpose seems to be that if wisdom involves all of these good things, then understanding how to fear the Lord has the purpose of bringing good things mentioned above, understanding riddles, receiving prudence, etc. Also, I wanted to point out that oftentimes people will say in that verse 7, right, the fear of the Lord is beginning of knowledge. I've heard people argue before that that word fear doesn't mean afraid, it's something else. So I looked it up. The word is actually yara, which we still use. There's a great prayer we use in the prayer book in Messianic Judaism, where it's called Adon Olam. It's throughout Judaism. You can find it, and we say the last words are Adonai li velo ira. The Lord is with me, so I will not fear. Does it sound like that would mean since the Lord is with me, I won't be in awe? No, it seems silly. The Lord is with me, I won't have reverence? No, it seems odd. No, the Lord is with me, I will not fear. So this word yara is actually the same word for fear. It's like terror, like an awesome fear. But either way, it's the same word. So we know that it is not enough to just get good things, right? We know that the wise avoid bloodshed when they can, such as sweat more now, bleed less later. Solomon begins, by urging his reader that the first way to begin to avoid evil is to listen to the instruction of your parents, right? So that's right there in verse 8. My son, hear the instruction of your father. Do not forsake the law of your mother. So in the Jewish tradition, again, it can often be seen through the reference to parents like mother or father, has a less literal meaning than we might use today. In fact, many cultures prior to more modern era, such as those in the feudal systems, did not focus on immediate family as being separate from distant ancestors, right? For example, Israelites were so called because they were the descendants of Jacob, who was called Israel. And sometimes they're even called the sons of Jacob. And this is like many generations after Jacob's death. They aren't his literal sons, but they are the sons of the sons of the sons, etc. So Solomon seems to be indicating both the literal use, listen to your father and mother, and the figurative use as in ancestral ones. In fact, every Saturday during the service, we have a prayer over the boys that say, may you boys be like Ephraim and Manasseh. And then over the girls, we say, may you girls be like the mothers of Israel, right? And it says mothers because it doesn't mean all of these women are mothers, his mothers, but rather that all of these women are mothers, and so it's the same generational continuance. So the collective wisdom of all previous generations, as well as the immediate wisdom of one's own parents, should not be forsaken. Just as I have inherited the wisdom from my mother and her from her grandfathers, and so on, like I've inherited the spanakopita recipe, we also have inherited the Spartan resilience from our ancestors. So not just immediate, but all the way back. Solomon even goes so far as to say that this wisdom will be like a crown on your head and chains about your neck, right? He says here in verse 9, for they will be a graceful ornament on your head like a crown and chains about your neck. It's curious about what those mean. It's probably similar to the way that officials and royal people were decorated at the time, right, and have been for all time. Royal people or important people wear crowns, just like they used to at the Olympics in Greece, and big necklaces to show their importance and your wealth. And so in this way, the wealth of wisdom can be shown by figurative. It will be like a graceful ornament on head and chains on your neck. In the next section, however, starting in verse 10, Solomon goes on to warn the readers against following the calls of sinners to entice, right? He says in verse 10, my son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait to shed blood, let us lurk secretly for the innocent without cause. And to swallow them alive like Sheol, right? So Sheol is a Hebrew word. It's like hell. It's probably more equivalent to like Hades in Greek. It's just where all the dead people go. But either way, to fill their own houses with spoil, he says in verse 13. and then to cast lots, right? To keep one's purse, to share. He tells the reader to flee all those things and then explains why. Solomon reveals in verses 16 through 19 that all of these things that they do are in vain, are being watched. He uses the analogy of trying to trap a bird in a net while it's watching you, right? So all their evil deeds are seen, and all the things will only result in their own blood. They can't escape it. They're being watched by the one who can see everything. He says, so are the ways of everyone who is greedy for gain. It takes away the life of its owners, right? And that's in verse 19. So it's the opposite of what we learned before, right? Sweat more now, bleed less later. These guys are ready to bleed right away. They're not avoiding the bloodshed at all. So Solomon is pointing out that sacrificing one's own desires in order to get to the right thing, or working hard now, not for one's own selfish gain, will result in not shedding their own blood, right? It's good. The hard work also tests someone's dedication to their greed, which will always fail, and replaces it with a dedication to only the most right things. So those who don't do the hard work will bleed more later. Sweat more now, bleed less later. So lastly, Solomon uses the poetic device of anthropomorphizing wisdom to be a woman. I wanted to call it anthropomorphizing, but it didn't fit with the alliteration, so bear with me. He makes wisdom a person, right? He persons her and explains how she calls out to everyone. In verse 20, it says that she cries out in the concourses, right? In the chief concourses, and she raises her voice in the open square. At the openings of the gates in the city, she speaks her words. Right, so this is a fairly complicated thing to flesh out, so bear with me for a second. Solomon turns wisdom into a person, a woman, calling out to God's people to repent. She asks in verses 22 to 23, how long will you simple ones love simplicity? For scorners delight in their scorning, and fools hate knowledge, right? Turn at my rebuke. Surely I will pour out my spirit on you. I will make my words known to you. And it's fun, this word simplicity, I looked it up. It's also like stupidity or slowness, but it can also mean like open-mindedness, which is kind of interesting. My dad's adoptive father used to say, be open-minded, but don't be so open-minded that your brains fall out. And this seems to be Solomon pointing to the same thing via the anthropomorphized wisdom as a woman. So God uses this time to get across his message both by his own voice and by the voice of this woman, that it is his divine attribute of wisdom that people will feel called back into righteousness, right? As I said before, the sweat of hard work really tests the grit of greed. So wisdom is a woman, a mother, asking Israel to turn back towards God and his righteousness. Through her is the potential for kind of saving from death, right? Listen to her generational wisdom and avoid evil things, like a mother scooping you back up. You know, she's willing to do that if you come back out of those nasty, sinful things. It also represents like a new birth, right? A turning back or repent. It's a clever imagery for the complex idea that Solomon is trying to present. Through the mother is salvation, but also a new birth, this mother of wisdom, which begins by fearing God. So Solomon then goes on to express that those who do not heed wisdom's warnings and who reject the wise counsel of God's wisdom, as if she's a person, will be laughed at and mocked in their calamity, right? She says, we're going to go to 25 through 32. Because you disdained all my counsel and would have none of my rebuke, I also will laugh at your calamity. I will mock when your terror comes like a storm and your destruction comes like a whirlwind. Right? When distress and anguish come upon you, then they will call on me, but I will not answer. They will seek me diligently, but they will not find me, because they hated knowledge and did not choose the fear of the Lord. They would have none of my counsel and despised my rebuke. Sound familiar? If we go all the way back to verse 7, fools despise wisdom and instruction. Same thing. So Solomon finishes up this section and this chapter, boiling it all down to this one idea, right? He says in verse 33, whoever listens to me will dwell safely and will be secure without fear of evil. Basically, to heed the warnings of wisdom will save the reader. Or, if you asked a Spartan, sweat more now, bleed less later.